and Coastal Infrastructures project that's a part of OFI. You can find information about that at coastalfutures.ca. With that, I will then turn this over to Dr. Smith. Thank you so much.
Thinking the unthinkable about preparing for climate change at the coast. We were just chatting there before this session, a topic that is certainly coming more and more to the fore. Thanks also for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm Glenn Smith. I'm a social science researcher with a background in originally marine planning, but more broadly marine and coastal issues. I did my PhD at the University of Tromsø in Norway, then went and did a postdoctoral position in University College Cork in Ireland, looking at climate resilience, think about community resilience at the coast, and currently coming towards the end of another postdoc position at the Flood Hazard Research Centre at Middlesex University. Fun fact, the Flood Hazard Research Centre was the world's first ever dedicated research centre for flood hazard. We actually moved office a couple of months ago, and I helped to move some of the documents and was looking at typewritten stuff they'd done back in 1972 and 73. So they'd been at this for a while. So just to give a brief overview of the presentation, I'm going to very quickly go over the Solaris project, which I'm working on at the moment, from which some of this material is taken. Then go a bit more specifically into coastal issues, looking at I always call it the boring bits, but there's a bit of policy and planning context for that. In England, this is all for England. And then I'm going to go and look at some examples, some case examples, Canvey Island, Rowhedge, Thorpeness, and East and West Wittering in West Sussex. Only this last case is actually from my current research. So I actually know a lot more about that case. The other ones I've kind of handpicked just to kind of expose some interesting issues around coastal climate change adaptation in England. And as I keep saying England, a lot of this is very England centric because the flood and coastal erosion responsibilities are actually devolved to the governments of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales less so. But there's also a few things. Oh, and then I'll go over some discussions, some conclusions and discussion points at the end, and hopefully give other people a chance to chime in. There's a few things that this won't be about. There's many things this won't be about. But the direction of national policy, I'm not really going to go into, not into too much detail on public engagement processes, although I can touch on that in the discussion. The Indigenous communities context here is missing. Obviously not completely missing in England, but a very, very different context to you guys over in Canada. And yeah, so that's a quick overview of the things I will and won't talk about. Obviously, astrophysics and things. There's plenty else that's going to be left out. But so the next two slides are about Solaris. They're not necessarily focused on the topic of today, but they give a bit of context. The Solaris project is a European research project. It's running over about 3 years in total. As I said, coming to an end in August of this year. And I work on the English side of it. We have partners in Belgium, Finland, and France. Solaris stands for Solidarity in Climate Change Adaptation Policies towards more socio-spatial justice in the face of multiple risks. So it's really a focus on justice and equality issues in the context of climate change, more specifically in the context of flood risk and of managing that flood risk. We work around 3 research questions that I haven't written out in full, but they focus on the role that justice plays in policy, so flood risk management policy, opportunities for stakeholder and public participation in decision-making, and the role of knowledge. We do all this in each country at the national level, and then looking locally at 2 case studies per country. And when we talk about justice, we have focused on distributional justice, so the distribution of costs and benefits in flood risk management, procedural, so that's looking at participation, opportunities for participation and perhaps where they don't exist and why that is, and also recognition justice, recognition of individuals and communities who are at risk, and perhaps again instances where those peoples aren't being recognized. As was mentioned in the introduction, this project gave me an opportunity to spend 2 months over at Dalhousie University last summer, thanks to the visiting fellowship program at the Ocean Frontier Institute, to kind of do a little comparative project on how that focused on specifically on coastal issues and climate adaptation at the coast. So just a reminder before I give a brief insight into some results, Solaris is not purely coastal. So we deal with fluvial flooding, pluvial, groundwater, surface water runoff, and coastal floodwater inundation as well. Wasn't really a minder because I think I just said that for the first time, but briefly some results. So national guidance is fairly vague. If we think about flood and flood risk management policy, doesn't really delve too deeply into issues of justice and equality. Going on to the second key result is that we've spoken to many sort of water managers who simply don't have the capacity to deal with this. There's a lot of people who think that dealing with justice and equality is less of a flood risk management issue, more of something that should be looked at in broader policy, immigration, education, access to healthcare, etc. But there are some encouraging signs. I have a slide that I've moved right to the end. I can go into that a bit more. But essentially, the Environment Agency in England is looking more specifically at the link between flood risk and indices of multiple deprivation, looking at a broader range of factors that might make people more vulnerable to flooding and perhaps less able to recover as well. So to give, when I said 2 slides, I meant 1 because I've just remembered I moved 1 to the end. I'm going to leave Solaris now and just kind of look at the more specifically at the topic of today. The National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management, as we call FCERM. The FCERM strategy is the main sort of policy for England, and the key objective of this policy is to work towards a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow, and to the year 2100. This number will come up a few times. It's kind of the temporal context of a lot of this stuff. So I'll be mentioning that a couple of times. Ready and resilient for flooding looks at things like defences, and that includes increasingly nature-based solutions in England, and more traditional flood defences, forecasting, warnings and evacuation. The system for that in England is actually pretty good and well drilled. We do get an awful lot of rain and a good amount of floods. Building back better is a key part of it as well. So that sort of focuses on flood recovery. And it fits quite nicely into an interesting broader theme of placemaking. And placemaking runs through a whole range of policy areas in the UK government, English government, or for English policy, with the idea being that we kind of create places that are nicer to live in, safer to live in. And obviously this doesn't then just focus on flood risk, but again, focuses on infrastructure, access to services, etc. And the government has set aside £5.2 billion between 2021 and 2027 to meet these objectives. The Environment Agency, as I said, is in charge of national flood policy and flood risk management. It's got a strategic overview role for flooding and coastal change. So that's a quick introduction to that. And a key tool in England, as in other countries, and this is something that I'll focus on a bit more today, is planning. And so the National Planning Policy Framework, which sits under the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Now, they've stated that as long as planning authorities implement national planning policy effectively, the increase in future property damage from flooding should be a relatively modest 4%. They do say, however, that if policy is weakened or is not implemented correctly, then this figure could be closer to 30% over the next 50 years. There's a 30% increase in future property damage. Obviously, property damage is quite a narrow focus, looking at specifically built assets, but still implement the policy through planning is the message there. Excuse me. Turning specifically to planning at the coast, which we'll be looking at a bit more today. There are two key planning jurisdictions involved. Land use planning in England extends to the low water mark, whereas marine planning extends inshore planning from 12 nautical miles to 0, which is in this case the high water mark. And this overlap is built in purposefully to ensure that plans on the dry and the wet side can kind of take one another into account, and that there is collaboration there, working together. This collaboration has been described thus by the Marine Management Organization, which overlooks marine planning. An important part of our marine plan making process is to engage with all local planning authorities, so it's kind of especially coastal planning authorities who have a stake in the marine area. And we are committed to fulfilling our duty to cooperate in line with the National Planning Policy Framework. There's that framework again. So that's key to a lot of what we're talking about today. This includes taking into account land use plans to ensure that their aims are fully considered during marine plan making. Couldn't argue with that too much. It's a noble cause, I think. Practitioners will tell you that the two spheres still work kind of pretty much detached from one another. There are obvious examples where marine infrastructure makes landfall, for example, but on the whole, I wonder if this is something that might kind of resonate in the room as well, is that the two systems are pretty much disjointed from one another. Also, another point is that the marine management remit does stretch quite far inland in tidal rivers. Just a kind of an added point there. This area itself, in the context of climate change, falls more under the, so let's see if I can minimize this window. Yeah, okay. Falls more under so-called shoreline management plans. I'll give you a bit more information about these shoreline management plans. This slide is a bit wordy, but the message is quite simple. These so-called SMPs they search the idea is to find sustainable approaches to managing the coast over 3 epochs. So this is from the present day to 20 years, 20 to 50, and 50 to 100. Again, starting at the beginning of the century, we're then roughly in the ballpark again of that 2100 year. And in terms of sustainable approaches, there are 4 approaches outlined. First one is to advance the line, building the coastline seaward, holding the line, definitely the most common amongst the shoreline management plans. Managed realignment, either landward or seaward. This is a kind of a managed approach, or no active intervention, sort of a stand back and do as little as possible. In addition to this kind of the last bit of the really boring bits, I think, it shouldn't be hard of it. It's not boring, it's very important, but a key management approach has existed. I think these were started in 2012, the coastal change management areas. This graphic is not too important to take all in and or memorize or anything, but just kind of gives an overview of how policy and guidance lead to these coastal management areas. And these coastal management areas deal specifically with change at the coastline. I've just added that there to emphasize that this is very much rooted again in planning. And the National Planning Policy Framework mandates that coastal planning authorities should identify these CCMAs, which cover parts of the coastline and are likely to experience significant change over the next 100 years. And that significant change relates to things like erosion, coastal landslip, permanent seawater inundation, coastal accretion. And the CCMAs severely restrict new development. That's why they play an important role, the kind of role that something like the Coastal Protection Act in Nova Scotia would play if some hurdles were overcome. We might come back to that at some stage, I suppose. But the idea of these CCMAs is essentially to severely restrict development in at-risk coastal areas. Briefly, they're put together by reviewing the shoreline management plans that I mentioned. Then there's more work put into identifying risk, mapping areas of risk. And there you go again, delivering adaptation through planning. However, research has since shown, or recently shown, that there's inadequate and ambiguous guidance, which has reduced the effectiveness of national policy, with coastal planning authorities unsure which data sets to use for delineating CCMAs. And the data sets that are available vary in erosion predictions and, perhaps quite bafflingly, do not account for expected sea level rise. Thus, only 15% of coastal planning authorities have designed a CCMA, with just that amounts to 5.7% of the coast of England, which is designated as a coastal change management area. And there's a lot of vulnerable coastal areas that have just been omitted from CCMAs. So there is an issue of implementation here. And this situation has kind of led me with some, I actually stole this, but led me to think more recently a lot about how we think the unthinkable at the coast. So planners in England agree that, I quote here, very few coastal local planning authorities seem prepared to think the unthinkable and limit new development in the already developed coastal zone. So I've become very interested in how we think the unthinkable, what the space is for that, where, who should be thinking about this, what the resources are for that, what the kind of messaging to the general public should be for that. And this has driven my recent research and also my stay over in Dalhousie over the summer. So that's kind of the first phase of the presentation. Going to assume most people are still awake, and just basically I'm going to go over a few examples of how some of this plays out on the ground. A bit of broader coastal climate change context in England. This graphic shows the kind of more and less resilient parts of the UK coastline, most of the UK, with reference to its kind of geological makeup and how resistant it is to coastal erosion. You can see the southeast of England certainly a lot less resistant, sorry. And a few key stats there. Around 45.6% of coastlines are protected. This, in many cases, doesn't mean job done. In the context of more frequent and intense storms and sea level rise, obviously some of those protected areas will need a rethink, but it does include also nature-based solutions. 28% of coastlines are deemed as vulnerable. Sea level rise is predicted to be between 0.27 and 1.12 meters. Again, there's that magic number by the year 2100, excuse me. And there are risk registers in England as well that look at the risk to mainly assets in the context of climate change in England. So 35 power stations along the coast, 22 clean water facilities, and 91 sewage water treatment works are also at risk. Just to add in there, and I'm not a geologist, so I've added this myself, but this is the approximate line of the isostatic rebound effect in the UK as well. And what that means is that everything sort of to the north and west of that line, top left of that line is slowly rising, and to the southeast is slowly sinking. And this is not an completely unimportant fact, because it's been predicted that this could increase sea level rise by 3 or 4 times the global average in the southeast of England. So really quite a significant process to consider there. I'm going to talk about, I did mention 4 case studies. 3 of them fit on this map. I've added them in there. We've got Canvey Island at the bottom, Rowhedge and Thorpeness. I'm actually speaking to you from the city of Colchester, which is just above where it says Rowhedge. And the little blue dot suggests that that's where I was on my way to London yesterday when I took this screenshot when I was on the train to London to go to the office. So first of all, Canvey Island, I just added this very briefly. It's not really an area of research of mine, but there was a news headline this week. So this is Canvey Island, you just about see it there on the right-hand side, east of London. And there are some flood defences there that date back to the 1930s and need work. This is sort of taken from the BBC. Sorry, I didn't reference that. And Canvey Island itself is a lot of it built on areas reclaimed from the sea. Much of it is below sea level at high tide. And in 1953, there was a huge storm in Europe that affected a lot of the southeast of England and obviously mainland and mainland Europe as well. In 1953, and on Canvey Island there were 58 deaths, and 2,500 homes were affected, as well as the fire station at the time. And there's very much a hold the line approach here, as that picture would suggest, going back to the shoreline management plans. And what I found interesting about this story is that a £75 million project has been given the green light. As you can read at the bottom there, this is a graphic showing what it would look like afterwards. And this will provide protection for over 6,000 properties on the island until 2070. And what struck me about that is that really isn't a very long time in the grand scheme of things. It seems we're entering a stage whereby there might be a lower return for increasing costs in some coastal areas in the context of climate change and protecting places like Canvey Island. Again, very brief example just to kind of illustrate that point, I suppose. Now, Rowhedge in England, just that map quickly again. Again, I'm up in Colchester. Looks like I was back home at that stage. And Wivenhoe is just to the southeast of us here. It's a really nice bicycle ride out there, actually. You can see Wivenhoe down at the bottom right there, and across on the west side of the River Colne there, the River Colne estuary, is Rowhedge. And what's interesting about Rowhedge, if you look at the sort of red dotted line demarcated area, I'm going to focus in on the bottom right bit that juts out into the estuary. And there's actually that little estuary area is covered in new housing now. And I don't know, I tried to have a look and I couldn't find out exactly when that housing was completed, but it is very new. So new, in fact, that if you go onto Google satellite images, as I did yesterday, you can see that it's still under construction. And that's fine because we do require new housing. There is a housing crisis here, so it's very much build, build, build. However, if you look at the flood risk data, if you consider that this shows the same little peninsula there, English flood risks are categorized as flood zones 1, 2, and 3. In a couple of slides' time, I have some figures about what that exactly means. But what you can see essentially here is that brand new houses have been built in an area that will be largely affected by the most severe flood zone, so flood zone 3, with that little spit potentially being cut off by that flood zone 2 area. So again, are we thinking the unthinkable by locking future risk in our efforts to meet housing demand? Perhaps needs a different approach overall. These risk areas also, they only show flood risk from rivers in the sea, and they're based on present day flood risk. So incredibly, they do not show how it may change in future because of climate change. And they ignore the effect of flood defenses shown, which isn't really applicable in this image. As you can see, there are not too many flood defenses close by. But that perhaps adds another layer of warning to this, is that in a way, these are best case scenarios, as they don't take climate change into consideration in what is an estuary area. So that is just another, again, not one of my research areas, but a case that shows a little bit more perhaps about the lack of implementation of some planning regulations, or the use of loopholes, but generally certainly a disconnect from the holistic picture of what it might mean to adapt to climate change at the coast. So the final example here, penultimate example here is from Thorpeness. Thorpeness is on the East Suffolk coast, marked there on that map. This is sort of what it looks like along that bit of coastline. It's a small enough village. I did mention that storm in 1953. This part of England was also very hard hit by that storm. And what I find interesting in the aftermath of that is that the coastline was reset where it was before the storm. And so the hold the line policy, which still exists along this part of coastline, is set on where the coast was pre-1953, pre a huge storm. And I'm not suggesting that people back then shouldn't have rebuilt there, but it kind of shows you how arbitrary really the hold the line approach can be at the coastline in a dynamic situation, which over millennia has fluctuated inland and seaward. But still the policy there is to very much kind of keep the hopes alive in Thorpeness. And I use this example also to show some kind of sporadic single household responses to this. So this is on that bit of beach there. And the little aerial photograph there shows that one property took it upon themselves to dump £750,000 sterling of Norwegian rock in front of their house on what is actually a public beach. How they got permission to do that, I'm not sure. But they're kind of looking after their own house. Some of you may know that depending on the direction of tides and winds, etc., that the eddies and the erosion processes can be exemplified either side of this. And so there is a greater erosion now just to the top right of those stones. And that next house along, so the top house in the picture on the beach, has now been demolished. That's actually been taken down, and it was no longer safe to live in. Again, doesn't show a very coordinated, holistic approach to adapting to climate change. Another thing I find interesting, you can't really see it, but in the bottom right picture, there's a small sign that just basically tells you not to climb on the rocks. But if you look at the top left picture, at high tide, this means you can't actually walk along the beach. So that obviously is an issue as well. Just across the road from them to the landward side is a relatively new house, which is this one, which has actually been designed and built to be moved. So within one small neighborhood, you've got two very different approaches to dealing with coastal climate change. I'll leave it up to you to decide perhaps which one would be more sustainable going forward. But I'm ending here on a couple of good news bits. Perhaps that's a good seg into last two messages of good news, is that the owners of the house that had to be demolished have actually been offered a plot of land inland for free to rebuild. And if you consider the lost revenue to a developer who, for the size of that house, might fit two more modest houses in that plot, it's actually quite forward thinking in response to the process of erosion in the area. So that's kind of a little, and this is very much not institutionalized yet, this process. This is kind of a one-off, but shows a glimmer of hope for the future of how we might relocate in some cases. Very quickly then, the final case study area. This is to the southwest of London, south coast of England, in the county of West Sussex. I mentioned the Witterings. You've got west and east Wittering there. Just to the east of this, you've got the town of Selsey. These are the flood risk zones that I mentioned earlier. So there's a 0.1 annual percent annual probability, 0.1 to 1% annual probability, and 1% or greater annual probability of flooding. And the story evolved here that the local council asked a consultancy company, environmental consultancy company, to assess flood risk in this area. And they firmly put it in zone 3. More recently, in fact, as recently as October of last year, there was a planning application to build 280 new houses in this area. Now, according to the planning system, there's nothing to stop that happening because the Environment Agency doesn't recognize this as risk, a zone 3 flood risk area. Remember, it's a consultancy agency that did the work. And so over months, there was back and forth, toing and froing between the Environment Agency, the consultants, the developer who wanted to build the houses. And on the 27th of September of last year, so this is very recent, the local council took a vote on whether to accept this planning application or to reject it. And the day before the vote, the developer sent all the councillors a letter and said, look, if you reject this application, what you're essentially doing is saying that all the existing houses along that beach, and that is 10,000 houses with a net value of 2.6 billion pounds, they're saying, you're essentially saying, you're writing them off and saying, look, you live in a high risk area, good luck with insurance, etc. But the councillors decided to stick to their guns. They decided to think the unthinkable and actually rejected the application and said, look, it just doesn't make sense to build houses here, even though if we follow planning guidelines as supported by the Environment Agency, then we could give the green light, but we have to think outside the box here. This doesn't make sense going forward in the context of climate change. And it all boils down to this shingle beach at the seafront, really. And this is the main sort of line of defense. Again, this is the line part of the country. And what the Environment Agency, sorry, backtrack, when the consultancy company did the work, this beach had been depleted by a storm, so it was at a lower level. And the consultants, through no fault of their own, assessed that and thought that that isn't enough protection, and thus gave it the highest risk, flood risk grading. And the Environment Agency said, well, we're going to replenish the shingle beach, and so the protection will be there. But again, all of this is on kind of the knife edge of, will there always be the resources to keep that beach replenished and build it probably even higher than it is now? So that kind of gives an overview of the case in West Sussex. And I've been told by local stakeholders that there just is no holistic vision for the coast along that part, and that really is also a national problem, a lack of holistic planning at the coast. So concluding remarks, perhaps a couple of questions as well. Where is the space to think the unthinkable? Thinking the unthinkable needn't be doomsday. It's not about scaring people. It's about asking important questions and thinking outside the box a little bit. Some mechanisms do exist. The coastal change management areas in England, this is a question of implementation. The Nova Scotian Coastal Protection Act potentially as well could be a very strong mechanism in this field. Again, implementation, resistance to that. And planning is key. Again, if you can implement planning guidelines. So thank you very much, and can return control. I can stop sharing. My new email, or my personal email address is there. I will be losing my work email address in about a week's time. So if I stop the share there.
Perfect. Now that was really interesting, Glenn. We're going to take questions. You can use the chat here to type in a question if you'd like. We'll relay it to Glenn and see if we can get those things answered. Maybe I'll start off a little bit because we started off with it in this discussion, and I was struck by some language that really seemed to emphasize both urgency and opportunity. Right, when you've got a framework for policy that is aiming to address the problem of coastal risk, and says if we implement this policy properly, we estimate we could see 4% in terms of damages, but that could go up to 30% if we do nothing. So there's both a sense of urgency and opportunity there, right? We're communicating, we've got a system, but then shortly afterwards, we're talking about what sounds like under implementation of a key tool for addressing this problem with the coastal change management areas being undersubscribed. So I'm wondering how much of this is just catching up to the urgency that we're facing in reality. How much are we just like, is it different agencies that are just some are behind, some are ahead? Are we all just trying to lurch towards an appreciation for the urgency of this situation? Or I don't know, is that changing too much?
Yeah, I think I mean the urgency is kind of writing itself right through physical processes, and in some instances, I think the national policy lacks teeth, and it's very noble in its kind of goals. Even things like placemaking. I think placemaking is a great aspiration, really. If you can have new neighborhoods that are well linked by cycle paths to good health services and schools and things like that. The placemaking policy sort of framework, I think, is very strong. The urgency perhaps is lost as well in an issue that I think we're all facing in how to communicate this to the general public as well. Again, trying to avoid doomsday talk, and it's been well proven that the psychology of fear doesn't really motivate people very much. But the age-old problem of how do my actions and my desires necessarily affect the whole, and how to communicate that it's difficult anyway, especially if you have your local council approving things that seem to make no sense, because there's a huge shortage of housing, for example. So I'm not sure that really answers your question, but perhaps I can't because yeah, acting on that urgency is a huge aspiration that in some instances, and again, my presentation overall today has been a bit negative. There's great things happening in England as well that we could go into, but yeah.
Well, I mean, your West Sussex example also shows, some sensible decisions being made even in the face of a housing crisis, but also pressure from developers, which is certainly something we see in the communities that I've lived in as well, very frequently, and we don't always see a sensible reaction to that. But yeah, that was a good example.
Just a follow-up point in that. I don't know how much this happens over there, but one thing that unfortunately happens here is that housing developers can often dissolve the company once the houses are built, and kind of just sidestep any responsibilities and it needn't be erosion or flood risk issues, but there are, so I forget the word now, when you're not responsible, take no liability essentially for what they create, and that is bit of an issue that happens here quite a lot. Perhaps you might have heard of the Grenfell fires in London. They're in tower blocks, and basically fire spread through the block because there was poor quality cladding, which caught fire and didn't meet regulations, and people just trying to see where the buck stops on that is so difficult.
Excellent. So we got a couple of comments here. Some comments just to the presentation overall, including comments from sociologists working in Nova Scotia, are pointing to the fact that this gives us some examples of what not to do, and it sounds like maybe also some models for approaching the issue of coastal resilience improvement overall. We do have a question here. Are there policies or campaigns to increase a sense of self-interest in a more holistic approach to get, I suppose that means to get communities on board with coastal risk management, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen just for a moment again there. I did have, these are not sort of proper slides really. Oh, I do have some references there as well. But this final one, I suppose, especially the especially the picture on the left there. This is somewhere where I went for Christmas actually with my parents, not this year, but the year before, on the North Norfolk coast. And you can see that the issue, that the situation amongst along this coastline is quite serious in some places. Incredibly, that house on the right, so this is a walk that I did along the beach to the pub. And when I came back an hour and a half later, it was dark and the lights were on and there was washing hanging to dry in one of the rooms. So that's still occupied, that house, which blows my mind. But North Norfolk coasts are working with an North Norfolk County Council are working with Coastal Partnership East on a coastal transition accelerator program, I believe it's called. And this program is really being designed to get the community together and kind of come up with a sort of co-design adaptation along the coast. And they won Resilience Innovation Funding, it's called. And so they're trying to kind of lead the way on not only do we have to adapt to the coast, but we also, there has to be some buy-in from local communities. And so I don't know too much about how the project is developing, but they are really kind of coming with some bottom-up ideas of how we might adapt at the coastline.
And that particular example referred to engineering with nature, right? Are they, I don't know what the language is like in the UK. Is that sort of green infrastructure is what I would think here? Is that what they're using there too?
Yeah, that one on the right, the estuary one, the other picture. Yeah. So that is actually pretty much that's at the Witterings that I just presented. It's in that area. It's called the Medmerry Nature Reserve. And it's essentially they just gave that estuary back to the sea. There was very little loss in terms of built assets, which kind of eased the process. But building with nature, nature-based solutions, and the government's doing a pretty good job of tying that in with placemaking as well. And so Medmerry was built primarily, or was sold primarily as a flood risk management scheme. But that area is hugely important for breeding birds as well. And so they've managed to attract a lot of birders to the area to come and spend a dime or two in the local economy as well.
Excellent. Perfect. We have a question there, Ron. I don't know if we've got it set up so microphones can turn on, but you can give it a shot, Ron.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi there.
I might have missed it, but who were you working with at Dalhousie?
I was working at Bertram MacDonald in the
Okay.
School of Information Management, although it changed its name when I was there. And Patricia Manuel as well at School of Planning. Recently, I think both of them have been trying to retire for a while. but they were my hosts.
And have either of them told you about the more recent major funding for transforming climate action here? It's a Dow Memorial, where Joel is from, and a couple of universities in Quebec. And it's 7-year kind of research, and a lot of it's about ocean and carbon absorption and that kind of climate change part. But a lot of the research is also about coasts, including Patricia and Bertram and others. So you might want to keep in touch if there's opportunities to collaborate there.
Yeah, cool. But I was very much aware of that. I think there's a echo in that. Yeah, I think I was very much aware of that going on. One of the last times I saw Bertram before I left, actually, it was you might have been, I don't know if you're involved, but there was a big room of people trying to decide where the funding was going. And so and Bertram gave me some documents to read through, and it all looked really, really interesting. There's still a research element to my new job going forward as well. And I know my students would be keen to hear about other things going on, so I'm definitely going to keep in close contact. I do typically meet with their research group, Marine Spatial Planning Research Group, every couple of weeks. So good lines kept open there. Thank you.
Okay, good, thanks.
I'll make a last call here for any final questions. I think we've got time for one more if anybody does have one.
Apart from, can I do it all again?
But give us some updates on new case studies 5 years into the future, exactly. Right? See how things are looking. Yeah, that'd be perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Glenn. That was really interesting. It's fascinating to see how things are working in different jurisdictions. And yeah. Thanks again to everybody who's shown up as well. I remind you that information about this a recording of this thing will go up sometime soon. If you've registered for this talk, you'll receive one fairly soon. I'll also stress that we also have another panel discussion coming up later on in this winter at the end of February on the 29th. This is going to be a panel discussion with a few people. We're going to talk about the implications of using different scenarios for the purposes of planning. So this builds a little bit on what Glenn was discussing. We've got different estimates of what the future might look like. There's some increasing conflict about which ones maybe should be emphasized or de-emphasized. And so you've got people who are from different perspectives who will address that. Some people who work with designing these scenarios, some physical scientists who use them, some engineers who make sense of them in the context of planning, and also some practitioners working with climate services who make sense of this for their various clients. So I expect it's going to be an interesting discussion. Again, February 29th, and there's a link here that you can find with our QR code. So with that, I'll sign off. We'll leave this up for a minute for anybody who wants to take down that information. But thanks again. I hope to see you all soon at this next event.